The morning sun cast long shadows across the empty highway as Lieutenant General James Marshall drove his sleek black sedan through the quiet town of Riverdale. The roads were nearly empty at this hour, just how he liked it. James had always been an early riser, a habit ingrained from 3 decades of military service. He glanced at his watch, 6:45 a.m. Plenty of time to reach the university where hundreds of graduating students awaited his commencement speech. James smiled to himself, remembering his own graduation day so many years ago. Who would have thought that skinny kid from South Chicago would one day wear 3 stars on his shoulder and command thousands? The GPS directed him to take the next right onto Maple Street, a tree-lined road that cut through the heart of Riverdale. James rolled down his window, letting the crisp spring air fill the car. The town was just waking up. A few joggers nodded as he passed, an old man walked his golden retriever, and a young woman opened the shutters of what looked like a small bakery. Nice little place, James thought, slowing as he approached a 4-way stop. He came to a complete halt, checked all directions, and proceeded through the intersection. In his rearview mirror, he noticed a police cruiser that hadn't been there before. The cruiser's lights suddenly flashed blue and red. What on earth? James muttered, checking his speedometer. He'd been going exactly the speed limit. With a sigh, he signaled and pulled over to the side of the road, under the shade of a massive oak tree. James had been pulled over before. As a black man driving nice cars throughout his life, it was almost a rite of passage. But it had been years since his last stop. The military plates and his careful driving usually kept him under the radar. He rolled down his window, turned off the engine, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen. The officer took his time approaching, and James used those moments to take a deep breath. Just a routine stop, he told himself. Probably a broken taillight or something minor. Officer Derek Simmons approached the car with his hand resting on his holster, a stance that immediately put James on alert. The officer was young, probably early 30s, with close-cropped blonde hair and cold blue eyes that didn't match his tight smile. "License and registration," Simmons said without preamble. No greeting, no explanation for the stop. "Good morning, officer," James replied, his voice steady and respectful. "May I ask why I've been pulled over?" Simmons's jaw tightened. "You ran that stop sign back there." James blinked in surprise. "Sir, I'm certain I came to a complete stop. I always do." "License and registration," Simmons repeated, his tone hardening. "Now," James nodded slowly. "Of course. My registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for it now, if that's all right." When the officer gave a curt nod, James carefully opened the glove compartment and retrieved the vehicle documents. Then, moving with deliberate slowness, he took out his wallet from his back pocket and handed both items to the officer. Simmons flipped through the documents with a frown, his eyes narrowing when he came across James's military ID alongside his driver's license. "This says you're a lieutenant general," Simmons said, suspicion heavy in his voice. "Yes, sir. United States Army, 30 years of service." Simmons looked from the ID to James and back again, doubt written across his face. "You expect me to believe you're some big-shot general?" James kept his expression neutral despite the disrespect in the officer's tone. "I understand your skepticism, Officer Simmons. If you'd like to verify my identity, you can call the Pentagon. They'll confirm who I am." A woman walking her dog slowed as she passed, clearly noticing the tension of the scene. Simmons seemed to notice too, his back straightening as he became aware of the witness. "Step out of the vehicle, please," Simmons ordered. "May I ask why that's necessary, officer?" James asked, still calm but increasingly concerned about the officer's behavior. "Because I told you to," Simmons snapped. "Or would you prefer I charge you with failing to comply with a police officer's orders?" 2 more pedestrians had stopped now, watching the interaction from across the street. One had taken out a phone and appeared to be recording. James weighed his options. He could argue his rights, but escalating the situation wouldn't help anyone. Years of leadership had taught him when to stand firm and when to be strategic. "Of course, officer. I'll comply." James slowly opened his door and stepped out, standing to his full height of 6'3". He was dressed in pressed khakis and a light blue button-down shirt, casual but neat, appropriate for the speech he would give later. Hands on the car. "Spread your legs," Simmons ordered. James complied, placing his palms on the warm hood of his sedan. "Officer." I want to cooperate fully, but I'm on my way to give a commencement speech at Riverdale University. I'm already dressed for the occasion, as you can see." Simmons ignored him, roughly patting him down with more force than necessary. The small crowd of onlookers had grown to about 5 people now, all with phones out, all watching silently. "Is there a problem here?" called a voice from the crowd. An older white man with silver hair stepped forward slightly. "Stay back, sir. Police business," Simmons barked without looking up from his search. James caught the older man's eye and gave a small shake of his head. The last thing he wanted was for someone else to get in trouble on his account. Finding nothing during the search, Simmons stepped back but didn't tell James he could stand up straight again. "Where are you coming from this morning?" "The Hampton Inn on Route 16. I drove in last night." "And what brings a so-called general to our little town?" James finally straightened up, turning to face the officer. "As I mentioned, I'm giving the commencement address at Riverdale University this morning. I was invited by President Chen several months ago." "Convenient story," Simmons said with a smirk. "But something doesn't add up here. Nice car, fancy watch, claiming to be some big military hotshot." James felt his patience wearing thin but kept his voice level. "Officer Simmons, I understand you're doing your job, but I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I did not run that stop sign, and my military ID is legitimate. A simple verification call will clear this up." "Or maybe you're impersonating a military officer," Simmons said, his voice rising. "That's a federal offense." The absurdity of the situation might have been comical if it weren't so serious. James had briefed presidents, commanded troops in combat zones, and managed billion-dollar military programs. Now he stood on a quiet street being accused of impersonating himself. "This is getting out of hand," called another voice from the growing crowd. "He's clearly not doing anything wrong." Simmons' face flushed red. He turned to James with cold determination in his eyes. "Put your hands behind your back." "Excuse me?" James couldn't hide his shock. "You're being detained while I investigate possible charges of falsifying military credentials and resisting an officer." "I've done nothing of the sort," James said firmly. "And I have not resisted in any way. Hands behind your back now," Simmons shouted, pulling handcuffs from his belt. The crowd erupted in protests, but James silenced them with a raised hand. His mind raced through scenarios and potential outcomes. Making a scene would only escalate the situation, potentially putting himself and the bystanders at risk. As a leader, he had always taught his soldiers to remain calm under pressure and to think strategically. "All right, officer," James said quietly, placing his hands behind his back. "But I want to be clear that I'm complying under protest. I've broken no laws today." The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. James stood tall, dignity intact despite the humiliation. The morning that had started with such promise now found him being led to a police cruiser in handcuffs, watched by a crowd of stunned onlookers. As Simmons opened the back door of the patrol car, James looked up at the blue sky and took a deep breath. This wasn't the first injustice he'd faced, and sadly, he doubted it would be the last. But he knew something Officer Simmons didn't. One phone call to the Pentagon would change everything. He just needed to remain patient until then. The door slammed shut behind him, and through the window, James could see people on their phones, some still recording, others perhaps calling to report what they were witnessing. One young woman looked directly at him and mouthed what looked like, "I'm sorry." Simmons got into the driver's seat and started the engine. As they pulled away from the curb, James caught a glimpse of his own car in the side mirror. The speech he'd worked on for weeks sitting on the passenger seat now going undelivered. Hundreds of students would be waiting for words of wisdom from a man trapped in the back of a police car because of one officer's prejudice. "Officer Simmons," James said calmly as they drove, "I want you to know that whatever happens next, I harbor no ill will toward you personally. But this stop was unjustified, and we both know it." Simmons adjusted his rearview mirror to look at James. For just a moment, uncertainty flickered across his face before hardening again into determination. "Save it for the station," he said, turning up the radio to drown out any further conversation. James leaned back against the seat and closed his eyes. Soon, he thought, soon this officer would learn exactly who he had in his back seat, and then the real conversation would begin. The police cruiser pulled into the Riverdale police station, a small brick building with an American flag hanging limply in the still morning air. James noted the time on the wall clock visible through the front windows, 7:28 a.m. His commencement speech was scheduled for 10 a.m., There was still time to sort this out, assuming reason would prevail. Officer Simmons cut the engine and stepped out, taking his time walking around to open the rear door. James had used the drive to center himself, drawing on meditation techniques he'd learned during a leadership retreat years ago. His anger had cooled into something more focused, a determined clarity about what needed to happen next. "Let's go," Simmons said, grabbing James's arm to guide him out of the car. "I can walk on my own, officer," James said calmly. Simmons hesitated, then stepped back, allowing James to exit the vehicle with as much dignity as the handcuffs would permit. Several officers lounging near the entrance stopped their conversation to stare as Simmons led his unusual detainee up the steps. Inside, the station was bright and surprisingly quiet. A middle-aged woman with graying hair pulled into a tight bun sat behind the front desk, looking up with mild interest as they entered. "Morning, Helen," Simmons called out. "Got someone here claiming to be a big-shot Army general. Ran a stop sign, then got belligerent." James kept his face neutral, though the mischaracterization stung. He hadn't raised his voice once during the entire encounter. Helen raised an eyebrow. "Processing room 2 is open," she said, her eyes lingering on James with something that might have been concern. Simmons led James down a short hallway to a small room with a metal table bolted to the floor and 3 plastic chairs. A camera blinked in the corner of the ceiling. "Sit," Simmons ordered, pointing to one of the chairs. "I'd appreciate it if you'd remove these handcuffs, officer," James said. "I'm not a threat to anyone, and they're becoming quite uncomfortable." Simmons paused, seemingly weighing his options. Finally, he pulled out a small key. "Turn around." James did as instructed, feeling immediate relief as the handcuffs came off. He rubbed his wrists, noting the red marks they'd left behind. "Thank you," he said, taking a seat at the table. "Wait here," Simmons said, as if James had any choice in the matter. "I need to speak with the sergeant." Left alone, James looked around the sparse room. The walls were a pale institutional green, and years of scuff marks tracked the bottom 3 feet. He wondered how many people had sat in this very chair, scared and uncertain about their future. How many of them had looked like him? The door opened and a heavy-set man with salt and pepper hair entered, followed by Simmons. The name tag on his uniform read, "Sergeant Wilson." "Good morning," James said, rising slightly out of respect for the ranking officer. Wilson waved him back down. "Stay seated, please. I understand there was an incident this morning." "There was a misunderstanding," James corrected politely. "I was pulled over for allegedly running a stop sign, which I did not do. When I presented my identification, including my military ID, Officer Simmons seemed to believe I was using false credentials." Wilson turned to Simmons with a questioning look. "He claims he's a lieutenant general in the Army," Simmons said defensively, "driving a car worth more than I make in a year." Something didn't add up. Wilson looked back at James. "Do you have your ID with you, sir?" "Officer Simmons has my wallet and documents," James replied. Wilson held out his hand and Simmons reluctantly handed over James's wallet. The sergeant examined the military ID carefully, his eyebrows rising slightly. "Lieutenant General James Marshall," Wilson read aloud. "That's a 3-star general, Simmons." "Could be fake," Simmons muttered, though with less conviction now. Wilson sighed and turned back to James. "Sir, I apologize for the inconvenience. We can clear this up quickly if you don't mind answering a few questions." "I'm happy to cooperate, Sergeant," James said, "but I should mention that I'm scheduled to give the commencement address at Riverdale University this morning at 10 a.m. President Chen and about 2,000 graduates and their families are expecting me." Wilson's face showed surprise. "You're the commencement speaker? I saw that in the local paper last week." He shot Simmons a look that suggested the younger officer might be in trouble. "I believe there's a simple way to verify my identity," James offered. "A call to the Pentagon would confirm who I am." "That won't be necessary," Wilson began, but Simmons cut in. "With all due respect, Sergeant, we should follow protocol. If he's really who he says he is, he won't mind us checking." James understood what was happening. Simmons was trying to save face to justify his actions by insisting on verification. Rather than back down, the officer was doubling down. "I don't mind at all," James said smoothly. "In fact, I insist." Wilson looked uncomfortable but nodded. "Fine, we'll make the call. But first, we need to complete the booking process." "Booking process?" James repeated, his calm slipping for the first time. "Am I being charged with something?" "Standard procedure," Wilson said, not meeting his eyes. Fingerprinting and photography. Then you can make your phone call. James recognized the tactic, a final attempt to humiliate him before the truth came out. He could argue, could demand to speak to a lawyer, but that would only delay things. Sometimes the fastest way out was through. Very well, he said, standing up. Let's proceed. Simmons looked surprised, clearly having expected more resistance. He led James to another room where an officer took his fingerprints, pressing each digit into a digital scanner. Then came the mugshot, front and profile. James stood tall, his expression dignified despite the indignity of the situation. As they returned to the processing room, James noticed the station had become busier. Officers glanced his way curiously, and he heard snippets of whispered conversation. Word was spreading about their unusual detainee. Now about that phone call, James said as they re-entered the room. Wilson nodded, placing a landline phone on the table. Go ahead. James dialed a number from memory. Not his lawyer, not his wife, not even President Chen to explain his delay. Instead, he dialed a direct line to the Pentagon, one few people outside the highest military circles would know. Is he seriously calling the Pentagon? Simmons scoffed, crossing his arms. The phone rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. Office of the Joint Chiefs, how may I direct your call? This is Lieutenant General James Marshall, he said clearly, aware of both officers watching him intently. Authorization code Sierra November 57 Tango Echo. I need to speak with Admiral Johnson immediately. There was a pause on the line. One moment for verification, General Marshall. Simmons shifted uncomfortably as the silence stretched. Wilson's face had gone slightly pale. General Marshall, came a new voice, deeper and with the unmistakable tone of command. This is Admiral Johnson. This is unexpected? Indeed it is, Admiral, James replied, his voice steady. I find myself in an unusual situation in Riverdale, about 2 hours north of Washington. I've been detained by the local police department following a traffic stop, and there seems to be some confusion about my identity. A beat of silence followed. I see, said the Admiral, his tone dangerously calm. May I speak with the officer in charge? James handed the phone to Sergeant Wilson, whose hand trembled slightly as he took it. This is Sergeant Wilson of the Riverdale Police Department. James couldn't hear what the Admiral was saying, but he could see the blood draining from Wilson's face. Yes, sir. No, sir. I understand, sir, Wilson stammered. Yes, he's right here, unharmed. No charges have been filed. Of course, sir, immediately. Officer Simmons was staring at James now, a dawning recognition in his eyes mixing with something else, fear perhaps, or the first inkling that he had made a terrible mistake. Wilson handed the phone back to James with a shaky hand. Admiral Johnson would like to speak with you again, sir. James took the phone. I'm here, Admiral. Are you all right, James? Johnson asked, his formal tone giving way to genuine concern. I'm fine, Thomas. A bit behind schedule, but unharmed. The Secretary of Defense is in the room with me. He'd like a word. James waited as the phone changed hands. Across the table, Sergeant Wilson was whispering urgently to Simmons, whose face had gone from ruddy to ashen. General Marshall, came the authoritative voice of the Secretary of Defense. I want to personally apologize for this incident. The governor is being contacted as we speak, and I've already dispatched military police to escort you to your speaking engagement. I appreciate that, Mr. Secretary, but MP escort won't be necessary, James replied. I'm sure the Riverdale Police Department will ensure I reach the university in time for my address. Wilson nodded vigorously at this, relief washing over his features. As you wish, General, the Secretary said. But I want a full report on this incident. There will be a thorough investigation. I understand, sir, James said, and I'll provide that report. But right now, my priority is those graduates waiting to hear from me. The call ended, and James placed the phone gently on the table. The room had fallen completely silent. Even the ambient noise of the station seemed to have dimmed. I believe, James said calmly, looking first at Wilson and then at Simmons, that we're finished here. Wilson jumped to his feet. Yes, sir. Officer Simmons will personally escort you to the university immediately. Your vehicle will be delivered there as well. Simmons looked like he wanted to protest but remained silent, his career flashing before his eyes. James stood, straightening his shirt, which had become wrinkled during the ordeal. I'd like my personal effects returned. Please. Wilson scrambled to gather James's wallet, keys, and phone, handling them now as if they were precious artifacts. As they walked through the station toward the exit, officers parted like the Red Sea, some standing at attention, others looking anywhere but at the three-star general they had unwittingly humiliated. Outside, the morning had blossomed into a beautiful day. James took a deep breath of fresh air, feeling the weight of the last hour begin to lift from his shoulders. "My car is over there," Simmons said quietly, pointing to his cruiser. As they walked toward it, James noticed a news van pulling into the parking lot. Word traveled fast in small towns. "It seems we have company," he observed. "Sergeant Wilson, I'd prefer to avoid making a spectacle of this situation if possible." Wilson nodded gratefully. "We'll use the side exit, sir. And again, on behalf of the Riverdale Police Department, I deeply apologize for this misunderstanding." Misunderstanding, such a small inadequate word for what had just occurred. But James simply nodded, knowing that the real conversation, the necessary one, would come later. For now, he had a speech to give. And perhaps, he thought as he slid into the passenger seat of Simmons's cruiser, he had just found its new opening line. The ride to Riverdale University was possibly the most uncomfortable 15 minutes of Officer Simmons's life. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, stealing occasional glances at the man beside him. Lieutenant General James Marshall sat in dignified silence, looking out the window at the town passing by. "Turn left at the next light," James said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, neither angry nor accusatory. Somehow that made it worse. Simmons nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, sir." The police radio crackled to life. "Unit 17, this is dispatch. Chief Bryant is requesting an immediate status update on your passenger." Simmons reached for the radio, but James held up a hand. "May I?" he asked. After a moment's hesitation, Simmons handed him the radio. "This is Lieutenant General James Marshall," he said clearly. "Please inform Chief Bryant that Officer Simmons is escorting me to Riverdale University as planned. We should arrive in approximately 7 minutes." There was a long pause before the dispatcher responded, her voice noticeably more formal. "Understood, General Marshall. Chief Bryant asks if you require anything further. Just my vehicle delivered to the university as Sergeant Wilson promised. Already en route, sir, and..." The chief extends his personal apologies. "Thank you, dispatch. Marshall out." He handed the radio back to Simmons, who took it without meeting his eyes. They turned onto University Avenue, a tree-lined street that led to the campus. Students in graduation gowns were already streaming toward the main quad, their families in tow carrying flowers and balloons. The sight reminded James why he was here in the first place, not to deal with prejudice, but to inspire the next generation. "Take the service road to the left," James instructed. "It will bring us closer to the administration building without driving through the main crowd." Simmons complied wordlessly, turning onto a narrower road that curved behind the historic buildings. President Chen was already waiting at the service entrance, pacing nervously. A tall woman with short gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, she rushed forward as the police cruiser pulled up. "General Marshall, we've been so worried," she said as James stepped out of the car. The Pentagon called, and then the governor's office. What on earth happened? James straightened his shirt, wishing he had time to change into his uniform as originally planned. "A misunderstanding that's been resolved, Dr. Chen. I apologize for the delay." Chen looked past him at Officer Simmons, who remained behind the wheel, looking like he wanted to disappear. Her expression hardened momentarily before she turned back to James with a professional smile. "Well, you're here now, and that's what matters. We have 30 minutes before the ceremony begins. There's a room prepared where you can freshen up, and your uniform arrived by courier just 10 minutes ago." James raised an eyebrow in surprise. "My uniform?" "Yes, delivered by military courier. Quite efficient, your Pentagon." Chen smiled, along with a rather intimidating military police escort, who are currently waiting by the stage. "I didn't ask questions, despite everything," James laughed. Thomas Johnson had always been thorough. The Secretary of Defense takes these matters seriously. As they walked inside, James turned back to Officer Simmons. "Thank you for the escort, officer. You're free to go." Simmons looked up, meeting James's eyes for the first time since the phone call. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again and simply nodded before driving away. Inside the administration building, A flurry of activity surrounded James. An aide showed him to a private room where, as promised, his dress uniform hung perfectly pressed. The sight of it, 3 stars gleaming on each shoulder, rows of medals and ribbons telling the story of his service, centered him. This was who he was beyond any labels or prejudices. As he changed, there was a knock at the door. "General Marshall, there's a call for you." "The governor," James sighed. Word had certainly traveled fast. He took the offered phone. "This is Marshall. General, this is Governor Howard. I cannot express how disturbed I am by what I'm hearing about your treatment this morning. Thank you for your concern, Governor, but I'm fine. Currently preparing for my commencement address." Of course. But afterward, I'd like to meet with you personally. This incident requires immediate attention at the highest levels." James recognized the political opportunity the governor saw. Standing up for a 3-star general against small-town police would make for excellent press. But James had other plans. "I appreciate that, sir, but I'll be handling this matter my own way. The Riverdale Police Department and I will be having some productive conversations in the coming days. But surely, with all due respect, Governor, I need to prepare for my address now. We can discuss this further afterward if necessary." After ending the call, James took a moment to gather his thoughts. The speech he'd carefully prepared no longer felt right. The events of the morning had changed things. He pulled out his notes and began making adjustments, crossing out entire sections and scribbling new thoughts in the margins. 20 minutes later, dressed in full uniform, James stood backstage as President Chen delivered her introduction. Through the curtain, he could see the sea of graduates in their caps and gowns, families filling the seats behind them. At the edges of the stage stood 4 military police officers at parade rest. Johnson's doing, no doubt, distinguished career spanning 3 decades. Recipient of the Distinguished Service Medal, the Legion of Merit and Bronze Star, currently serving as the Deputy Commander of U.S. Army Forces Command. Please welcome Lieutenant General James Marshall. The applause was thunderous as James walked onto the stage. He approached the podium with measured steps, taking in the faces before him. Young, hopeful, diverse. The future. As the applause continued, he noticed movement at the back of the audience. Several Riverdale police officers had arrived, including Sergeant Wilson and Chief Bryant. And at the very edge, almost hidden behind a column, stood Officer Simmons in civilian clothes. James waited for the applause to die down before speaking. "Thank you, President Chen, for that kind introduction. And thank you to the faculty, families, and most importantly to you, the graduates of Riverdale University." He looked down at his revised notes, then set them aside. "I had a speech prepared about perseverance, excellence, and service. It was a good speech. But something happened this morning that changed my perspective on what I needed to say to you today." A murmur went through the crowd. Some people were checking their phones. The story was already spreading on social media. On my way here, I was pulled over and detained by a police officer who couldn't believe that someone who looks like me could possibly be a 3-star general in the United States Army. James paused, letting the words sink in. My military ID was questioned. I was handcuffed, taken to the police station, fingerprinted and photographed like a criminal. Gasps rippled through the audience. President Chen shifted uncomfortably in her seat behind him. At the back, Chief Bryant's face had gone pale. One phone call to the Pentagon changed everything. Suddenly, I wasn't a suspicious character anymore. I was Sir and General and worthy of respect. James leaned forward slightly. But here's the thing. My worth as a human being didn't change when they learned my rank. I was the same person in handcuffs that I am standing before you now. The crowd was utterly silent now, hanging on his every word. I tell you this not to complain about my morning, but because you're entering a world that will sometimes judge you before knowing you. Some of you, because of your skin color, your accent, your gender, your faith, or who you love, will face moments when others try to reduce you to a single characteristic. James straightened to his full height, his voice gaining strength. In those moments, remember this. No one can diminish your worth unless you allow them to. No one can tell you who you are or what you're capable of. That power belongs to you alone. He looked out at the graduates, making eye contact with as many as he could. I've commanded thousands of troops, managed billion-dollar programs, and briefed presidents. But none of that would matter if I hadn't first commanded respect for myself. From the corner of his eye, James noticed Officer Simmons shifting uncomfortably, but he continued. The world isn't always fair. We know this. But how you respond to unfairness will define you more than the unfairness itself. James stepped away from the podium, moving closer to the edge of the stage. I could have responded with anger this morning. It would have been justified. Instead, I chose dignity, not because I'm special, but because dignity is a choice available to all of us regardless of circumstance. He paused, looking toward the police officers at the back of the crowd. And let me be clear, holding others accountable for their actions can be done with dignity too. Justice and vengeance are not the same thing. James returned to the podium, his voice softening slightly. You're graduating at a time of great division in our country. It would be easy to retreat into tribes of people who look like you, think like you, vote like you. I'm asking you to do something harder, to see the humanity in everyone, even those who fail to see it in you. He smiled then, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. That's what I did in my 3 decades of military service. I served alongside people from every background imaginable. We didn't always agree. We didn't always understand each other. But we learned to respect each other, to trust each other because our lives depended on it. James looked out at the sea of faces once more. Your generation has the chance to heal divisions that have festered for too long. Not by ignoring differences, but by finding common ground despite them. He stepped back, his voice resolute for his closing words. When I leave here today, I'll be meeting with the Riverdale Police Department, not to demand punishment, but to create understanding, because that's how real change happens. Not from the top down, but from the inside out, one conversation at a time. The silence held for a beat, then 2, before the audience rose to their feet in thunderous applause. Some were wiping away tears. Others were nodding vigorously. President Chen stood too, clapping with visible emotion. At the back of the crowd, even Chief Bryant was applauding, his face a complex mixture of shame and respect. Only Officer Simmons remained still, his expression unreadable as he watched the 3-star general receive a standing ovation for turning a morning of indignity into a moment of profound teaching. The reception, following the commencement ceremony, buzzed with excitement. Students and parents formed a line to meet Lieutenant General Marshall, many mentioning how his speech had moved them. Some shared their own experiences with prejudice, while others simply wanted to thank him for his honesty. Through it all, James maintained a warm smile and genuine interest in each person he met, though his mind was partly on the meeting to come. General Marshall, a voice called from behind him. James turned to see Chief Bryant approaching, hat in hand with Sergeant Wilson and 3 other officers following a respectful distance behind. Notably absent was Officer Simmons. Chief Bryant, James acknowledged with a nod. I was planning to come to the station after this reception. I thought it might be better to meet on neutral ground, Bryant said, his discomfort evident. If you're willing. James excused himself from the graduates he'd been speaking with and led the chief to a quiet corner of the reception hall. I appreciate you coming here, Chief. It shows good faith. Bryant nodded, his weathered face solemn. Your speech was eye-opening, General. I want you to know that what happened this morning doesn't represent our department's values. Doesn't it? James asked quietly. The question hung in the air between them. Bryant opened his mouth to offer a reflexive denial, then closed it again. After a moment, he sighed. Maybe it does in ways I haven't wanted to see. James nodded, appreciating the honesty. The first step towards solving any problem is acknowledging it exists, Chief. The governor's office has called 3 times already, Bryant said. The mayor, too. They're demanding Officer Simmons be fired immediately. And what do you think should happen? Bryant looked surprised by the question. He detained a 3-star general without cause. His career is over. Is firing him the easy way out? James asked. For you and the department, I mean. One bad apple removed, problem solved? The chief frowned. What are you suggesting? Before James could answer, President Chen approached with a concerned expression. I'm sorry to interrupt, General, but there's a situation developing outside. The local news crews have arrived and they're interviewing students about this morning's incident. There's also a small crowd gathering with signs. It appears word has spread. James nodded thoughtfully. Thank you, Dr. Chen. Would you mind if the chief and I used your office for a few minutes? I think we need to discuss next steps before this escalates further. Of course, she agreed, handing him a key card. 3rd floor, end of the hall. Take as long as you need. As they walked through the administration building, they passed a window overlooking the front lawn. Sure enough, 2 news vans were parked at the curb and reporters were interviewing graduates still in their caps and gowns. A group of about 30 people had gathered near the university gates, some holding hastily made signs reading, "Justice for General Marshall and End Police Racism." "This is getting out of hand," Bryant muttered. "It's getting attention," James corrected. "There's a difference." President Chen's office was spacious and elegant with tall windows overlooking the campus. James took a seat on one of the couches and gestured for the chief to join him. "Chief Bryant, I want to be clear about something. I'm not interested in destroying Officer Simmons's career or in publicly embarrassing your department." Bryant looked skeptical. "With all due respect, General, you just told 2,000 people about how my officer handcuffed you without cause." "I shared my experience," James said calmly. "I didn't name Officer Simmons or call for his firing. There's a reason for that." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. 30 years in the military taught me something important. Punishment without education changes nothing. You can fire Simmons today and the underlying problems in your department will remain tomorrow." Bryant shifted uncomfortably. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A partnership," James replied. "The Pentagon has already authorized me to extend my stay in Riverdale by 3 days. I'd like to use that time to work with your department on bias training and community relations." "Bias training?" Bryant repeated, sounding defensive. "Let me ask you something," James said. "When was the last time your officers received any training specifically addressing racial bias in policing?" The chief's silence was answer enough. "It's not just your department," James assured him. "It's a nationwide issue. But we have an opportunity here to turn an ugly incident into something constructive." Bryant rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "And what about Officer Simmons?" "I'd like to speak with him directly," James said. "I saw him at the back of the ceremony. He came in civilian clothes, which tells me he's on administrative leave. Effective immediately after I heard from the Pentagon," Bryant confirmed. "Standard procedure," James nodded. "I appreciate that. But I don't want him fired, at least not automatically. I want him to be part of this process." The chief looked stunned. "You want to work with the officer who detained you?" "I want to understand him," James corrected. "And I want him to understand the impact of his actions, not just on me, but on your community. Real change doesn't come from punishment alone. It comes from confronting uncomfortable truths and finding a better way forward." Bryant shook his head in amazement. "Most people in your position would be calling for his badge, filing lawsuits, talking to every news outlet that would listen." "I'm not most people," James said with a slight smile. "And scorched earth tactics rarely build anything worth having." He stood and walked to the window, looking down at the growing crowd below. "Those people out there want justice. But justice comes in many forms. Sometimes the most powerful form isn't punishment but transformation." His phone buzzed with a text message. James glanced at it and smiled. "Perfect timing. The mayor is requesting a meeting with both of us at City Hall in 30 minutes. The governor will be joining by video call." Bryant looked nervous. "What are you going to tell them?" "The truth," James said simply. "That the Riverdale Police Department and I are forming a partnership to address bias in policing and improve community relations. That we're turning an unfortunate incident into an opportunity for growth." "Just like that?" Bryant asked, skeptical. "Just like that," James confirmed. "Unless you object?" The chief considered for a long moment, then slowly extended his hand. "No objection, General. In fact, I think it might be exactly what we need." They shook hands just as James's phone rang. He checked the caller ID and showed it to Bryant. "The Secretary of Defense again. He's been calling hourly for updates. Should I step out?" Bryant asked. "No need," James said, answering the call. "Mr. Secretary." "Yes, sir, I'm well. In fact, I'm sitting with Chief Bryant of the Riverdale Police Department right now." "No, sir, I don't think that will be necessary. Actually, I have a different proposal." Over the next few minutes, James outlined his plan for a collaborative approach instead of a punitive one. As he spoke, Bryant watched with growing respect, occasionally nodding his agreement when James glanced his way. "Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I appreciate your support on this." "Yes, I'll keep you updated. Good afternoon, sir." James ended the call and turned to Bryant. "The Secretary has approved my extended stay and will be providing resources for our training initiative." "I don't know what to say," Bryant admitted. "This morning, I thought my department was facing a public relations disaster and possible federal investigation. Now we're forming a partnership with the Pentagon? Life takes unexpected turns, James said with a slight smile. Now there's one more person we need to talk to before our meeting with the mayor. Simmons, Bryant guessed. James nodded. Is he still here? I told him to wait in my car, Bryant admitted. I wasn't sure what would happen after we spoke with you. Let's not keep him waiting. Then. They found Officer Simmons sitting in the chief's unmarked police car, staring straight ahead with a blank expression. When he saw them approaching, he straightened up, his face a mask of anxiety. James gestured for him to step out of the car. Simmons did so reluctantly, standing at stiff attention, his eyes fixed somewhere over James's shoulder. Officer Simmons, James began, do you understand why what happened this morning was problematic? Simmons swallowed hard. Yes, sir. I made an error in judgment and detained you without sufficient cause. That's part of it, James acknowledged. But there's more to it than that, isn't there? For the first time, Simmons met his gaze directly. Something in James's tone had cut through the rehearsed response. I saw what I expected to see, he admitted quietly. A black man in an expensive car who couldn't possibly be who he claimed to be. James nodded, neither angry nor accusatory. Bias often works that way. It filters what we see to match what we expect to see. I've lost my job, haven't I? Simmons asked, looking between James and the chief. That depends, James replied. I've proposed an alternative to Chief Bryant. Instead of termination, you would be the first participant in a new training program on bias in policing. You would work directly with me over the next 3 days, and together we would develop materials to train the rest of the department. Simmons blinked in surprise. You want to work with me? After what I did? Sometimes the people who make the mistakes have the most to teach others about avoiding them, James said. But it would require complete honesty from you, Officer Simmons, about your assumptions, your biases, your thought process this morning. No defensiveness, no excuses. Why would you do this? Simmons asked, genuinely confused. Why not just destroy me and move on? Because destruction is easy, James said. Building something better is harder, and in my experience, harder paths often lead to better destinations. He looked at his watch. We have a meeting with the mayor in 20 minutes. Chief Bryant and I will present our partnership plan. The question is, are you willing to be part of it? Simmons looked at the chief, who gave him a slight nod, then back at James. The crowd at the gates was now visible from where they stood, their chants faintly audible across the campus. News crews were setting up additional cameras. The story was growing by the minute. I don't deserve a second chance, Simmons said finally. No one does, James replied. That's why they're called chances, not guarantees. The question is what you'll do with it. A long moment passed before Simmons straightened his shoulders and nodded once, decisively. I'm in, sir. Whatever it takes. Good, James said, checking his watch again. Then let's not keep the mayor waiting. We have important work to do. As they walked toward James's car, delivered as promised to the university parking lot, Bryant leaned over and asked quietly, Do you really think this can work? James looked back at the crowd by the gates, then at Officer Simmons following a few steps behind them, his face set in determined lines. I think it has to, he replied, because the alternative is more division, more fear, more incidents like this morning. And that's not the world I've spent my life trying to build. He opened the car door, his 3 stars catching the afternoon sunlight. Sometimes leadership means taking the harder path and trusting others to follow. Today we take the first step. Tomorrow we'll see where it leads. 3 months later, James Marshall stood at the back of the Riverdale Community Center, watching as Officer Derek Simmons addressed a room full of police officers and community members. The transformation was remarkable. I didn't wake up that morning planning to discriminate, Simmons was saying, his voice steady despite the difficult subject matter. I would have told you I treated everyone the same. But when I saw Lieutenant General Marshall driving that car, I made assumptions based on nothing but the color of his skin, and those assumptions led me to actions that violated both his rights and the oath I swore to uphold. The room was silent. Everyone focused on the officer's words. Chief Bryant sat in the front row, nodding encouragingly. What I've learned over these past months is that bias isn't always conscious. Simmons continued. Sometimes it's buried so deep we don't even recognize it in ourselves. But that doesn't make its impact any less real for the people on the receiving end. James smiled slightly. Simmons had come a long way from the defensive, frightened officer in the police car 3 months ago. The journey hadn't been easy for either of them. The day after the commencement speech, they had begun the hard work of transforming the incident into a learning opportunity. The meeting with the mayor and governor had gone better than expected, with both officials cautiously supporting James's proposal for a collaborative approach rather than punitive measures. "I'm still not convinced this is the right move, General," the governor had said privately after the meeting. "Officer Simmons should face consequences for his actions." "He is facing consequences," James had replied. "Just not the kind you can measure with a pink slip or a court judgment." The initial 3-day training session had expanded into a comprehensive program. James had called in favors from colleagues at the Pentagon, bringing in experts in implicit bias training and community policing. What started as a response to one incident grew into something bigger, a model program that was already drawing interest from police departments in neighboring counties. Now, as Simmons concluded his presentation and opened the floor for questions, James felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Helen, the desk sergeant from that first morning at the police station. "General Marshall," she said with a warm smile, "I thought you might like to see this." She handed him a tablet displaying an email from the Department of Justice. "They want to use our program as a model for departments across the country." James scanned the email and nodded appreciatively. "This is excellent news, Helen. Chief Bryant must be pleased." "He's walking on air," she confirmed. "Says it's the proudest moment of his career." She hesitated, then added, "None of this would have happened if you'd chosen anger over understanding that day." A community member had approached the microphone to ask Simmons a question. "How do we know this isn't just for show? That things will actually change in how police treat people who look like me?" It was a fair question, and James watched with interest as Simmons took a moment to consider his response. "I can't promise perfection," Simmons admitted. "What I can promise is accountability. Every officer in this department now wears a body camera that activates automatically during traffic stops. Our stop data is reviewed monthly for patterns of racial disparity. And most importantly, we formed a community oversight committee with real power to review complaints." He gestured to a diverse group sitting together on one side of the room. "These committee members represent every neighborhood in Riverdale. They don't work for us. We answer to them." James hadn't noticed the young woman approaching until she was standing beside him. She looked college-aged with a notebook in hand. "General Marshall? I'm Lin Wong from the Riverdale University newspaper. Would you mind answering a few questions about today's session?" "Not at all," James replied, stepping with her into the hallway where they could speak more privately. "This program seems to be making real changes in Riverdale," Lin began. "Did you expect this level of success when you first proposed it?" James considered the question carefully. "I hoped for it. But real change requires willing participants. Officer Simmons and Chief Bryant deserved most of the credit for being open to a different approach." Lin made a note before asking her next question. "Some critics say Officer Simmons got off too easy, that he should have been fired for his actions that day. How do you respond to that?" "Firing Simmons would have been the end of the story," James replied. "One officer removed, problem seemingly solved. But the underlying issues would have remained unaddressed." He gestured toward the room where the session continued. "This approach has changed not just one officer but an entire department and increasingly, a community." "And on a personal level," Lin pressed, "was it difficult to work so closely with someone who had treated you that way?" James smiled slightly. "Of course it was. There were uncomfortable conversations, moments of defensiveness on both sides, but discomfort is often where growth begins." "One final question," Lin said, looking up from her notebook. "You could have used your position and connections to punish the department. Instead, you chose a much harder path. Why?" It was the same question the governor had asked that Simmons himself had asked. James took a moment before answering. "Throughout my military career, I've learned that true leadership isn't about wielding power. It's about using whatever influence you have to leave things better than you found them." He glanced back toward the community center room. This approach gave everyone a chance to be part of the solution, rather than just symbols in a conflict. When the session ended, people lingered, forming small discussion groups. James noticed Simmons speaking with the person who had questioned him earlier. Their conversation seemed intense but respectful, with both nodding as the other spoke. It wasn't perfect harmony, but it was something far more valuable: genuine dialogue. Chief Bryant made his way through the crowd to where James stood. "General, there's someone I'd like you to meet." He gestured to a young black man beside him, perhaps 20 years old. "This is Michael Wright. He's interested in joining our department." The young man extended his hand nervously. "It's an honor, sir. Your speech at graduation changed how I saw things. I'd always thought about becoming a teacher, but then I realized maybe the best way to change the system is from within." James shook Michael's hand firmly. "The department would be lucky to have you, Mr. Wright. We need officers who understand the communities they serve." "That's what I told him," Bryant agreed. "We've implemented a new recruitment strategy focused on building a department that reflects our community's diversity." As they talked, James's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from the Secretary of Defense. "Program expansion approved. Funding secured for nationwide implementation. Well done, James." He smiled as he slipped the phone back into his pocket. What had begun as a humiliating detention on a quiet morning had evolved into something neither he nor Officer Simmons could have imagined. Later that evening, as James prepared to leave Riverdale, likely for the last time, he took a detour past the spot where he'd been pulled over 3 months earlier. The intersection looked exactly the same. The four-way stop sign, the large oak tree, the bakery on the corner now closed for the night. Yet everything had changed. He pulled his car to the curb and sat for a moment, reflecting on the journey. His phone rang, the Pentagon calling again with updates about the program's national expansion. Before answering, James looked once more at the intersection where an act of bias had set in motion an unexpected chain of events. The easy path would have been righteous anger. Public condemnation demands for punishment. It might have felt satisfying in the moment. Officer Simmons would have lost his job, become a cautionary tale, a symbol rather than a person capable of growth. Instead, that intersection had become the starting point for something constructive. Not perfect, there was still much work to be done, but moving in the right direction. James answered the call. "Marshall here. General, we've got the green light for the first 5 cities," said the voice on the other end. "The Attorney General wants to make this a centerpiece of the new policing initiative." "Excellent news," James replied. "Send me the details and I'll review them tonight." As he ended the call and put the car in drive, James glanced once more at the stop sign, the place where Officer Simmons had claimed he hadn't stopped completely. The irony wasn't lost on him. Sometimes progress began precisely at the points where we were falsely accused of failing to stop. He pulled away from the curb, heading toward the highway that would take him back to Washington. In his rearview mirror, the lights of Riverdale grew smaller, a town forever changed because a 3-star general and a biased police officer had both been willing to take a different path. In the center of town, the community meeting was breaking up. People walked to their cars discussing what they'd heard, some with fresh perspectives, others still skeptical but engaged. Officer Simmons gathered his materials, exchanging a few words with Chief Bryant before heading home. Later that night, as he prepared for bed, Simmons noticed a small package that had been delivered to his door. Inside was a simple frame containing the newspaper article about the program's success. A note was attached. "The true measure of a person isn't in never making mistakes, but in how they respond when those mistakes are revealed. Your response has made all the difference. LTG James Marshall." Simmons placed the frame on his desk where he would see it every day, a reminder not of his worst moment but of what had grown from it. Tomorrow he would continue the work they had started, not because it was required, but because he had come to believe in it. In Washington, James arrived at his Pentagon office just before midnight, reviewing the implementation plans for the new nationwide program. An aide brought him coffee and a folder of press clippings about the Riverdale initiative. "Remarkable results, sir," the aide commented. "Who would have thought that morning would lead to all this?" James smiled, thinking of the young recruit Michael Wright, of Officer Simmons's transformation, of communities and police departments finding new ways to understand each other. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "our most difficult moments contain the seeds of our greatest contributions. We just have to be willing to plant them rather than burn them in anger." The aide nodded and left him to his work. Outside the window of his Pentagon office, the lights of Washington shimmered. Somewhere in those lights were other officers, other communities, other opportunities for the same difficult, necessary conversations that had begun in Riverdale. One incident, one choice to respond differently, and now, the possibility of genuine change rippling outward, touching lives he would never meet. It had been worth it, James thought. Every uncomfortable moment, every difficult conversation, every second chance given and received worth it all.